Danny, Stephen, thank you both very much indeed for coming to join us in a busy week and on a day when we have a leaked document bursting on the scene. We'll come back to other stuff that we've seen in the last few days, but that's the latest development. Jeremy Corbyn was waving it around. Does it look at first glance as though it has the potential to change any of the dynamics of this election? Stephen?
So I don't think it does, with the disclaimer I've only read the first 250 pages of it. I think it... So it's
I think that's a virtue signalling kind of apology.
It's effectively the kind of scoping exercise in a trade negotiation. So it's basically the bit where you kind of go, here are the bits of your economy we like, and you go to them, here are the bits of your economy we like. Now, of course, that scoping exercise involves at the US end them going, by the way, that means the NHS and agri-food. However, there is not a moment in it in which the UK side goes, of course, you can have agri-food and the NHS.
And here's a knife and fork to eat them with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think without that moment, the Conservatives can say, well, look, in a negotiation, you know, in the exit talks, the EU said we would have to do X, Y, and Z. We didn't. We said we would do QP and R. We didn't. That's how it works. And I think then, because they'll be able to have that message, I think it won't change the dynamic of the election. I think what we've really seen here is the significance of, because Corbyn lost the internal battle to keep Labour's position as a Brexit party, right? He wanted ideally to be able to go into this election as a party of soft Brexit rather than of a referendum. Because this election is being framed as to do Brexit or perhaps not do it, the Conservatives aren't having to answer questions about the details of their plan. Because the follow-up question to them saying, well, we won't sign over the NHS is, well, how are you going to get the meaningful, deep US trade deal that you are going to need to make up for the lost economic trade with Europe if you're saying large chunks of our economy aren't on the table? But because for them they can just say it's Brexit or no Brexit, that debate's not going to happen.
And Danny, do you think, does it have the capacity to change it?
Well, first, most voters will have read 250 pages less than Stephen of this document. So let's have a look what we think. This is less about whether it's significant in itself and more what's likely to happen. It will clearly mean that the story moves on from a story that's been deeply uncomfortable for Labour. That's obviously a good thing. That it may come anti-Semitism and a chief rabbi's attack, which has been very dominant for a couple of days. Corbyn's interview played into that. It was still running very strongly today. You know, as a campaign, if you were in a campaign, you'd be desperate to move it on because you certainly wouldn't grid the chief rabbi's attack, right? So whereas this you would. So they'll be pleased that that's the first thing. Secondly, it clearly highlights an issue they wish to raise the salience of and gives you some chance of raising the salience of it. I don't think you're likely to be able to raise the salience of it much unless it has something that all journalists objectively think, well, that's absolutely serious and we're going to question you about it for several days. And I just don't think that's there. It definitely is a good thing for Labour and not a good thing for the Tories that they came out with this document because it highlights their issue rather than the issues that Labour was under pressure on before. But my view is we should be very wary about how much any of these day-to-day victories, defeats, people just do not notice them. They screen them out. Yeah, there's a bit of heightened awareness in an election campaign that isn't there at any other time, but I don't think so. I think in some, it's insofar as it changes things, it helps Labour a little bit to move on to their agenda. It's possible that something else may catch fire on the basis of it, and we may look back on it and think it was significant.
And President Trump's here next week,
correct,
isn't he?
So that's an example.
There'll be photo ops there. He could shoot his mouth off in some way that plays into all of this.
Look, it helps. Labour's trying to get up what, you know, I must admit, I think is a bit of a bogus argument because if we joined the customs union, we wouldn't have any control over European negotiation of any of this. So, and it could just as easily happen under a TTIP arrangement. So it could link up into an issue. It will increase the salience for traditional Labour voters. That is good. Certainly, if you were organising Labour's campaign, you'd want to be on this issue, and they are. So that is a good thing for them.
Just to come back to something you said, Stephen, though. We're not really throwing a huge focus in this campaign. We're not seeing one thrown on the whole issue of what Brexit will be like and how much we'll be able to squeeze out of a free trade agreement with Europe and the United States. And the whole this is meant to be a fork in the road, an amazing sort of turning point potentially, but the focus isn't there. What do we learn just from glancing at the first, skimming at the first 250 pages or whatever of these documents? What do we learn about our chances of entering a new happy state post-Brexit?
I think so. The overwhelming thing we learn once you accept, and I think actually Danny's right to say that the prospect of any democratic government signing up to those things is fairly remote. The main thing you really separate is how thin the gruel is available. And one of the items is the desire for an NFL franchise. Now, NFL is not for me. I prefer real football, but I get lots of people love it, but that ain't going to replace just-in-time manufacturing within the single market and customs union. And it really does bring home actually how, although there are real gains to be made from having your own independent trade policy, if you give up not just customs union membership but single market membership, unless you are really willing to go, everything must go, the prizes on offer are quite small.
Is that what it feels like to you, Danny, just glancing at it? The shallow deals that can be out there?
Obviously, the more important trade deal is the one that Britain will do first with the European Union, if it does one at all. Doing the trade deal with the United States is years off, because it's not just a matter of what the president thinks, who may not be the president after all, by the time we even get into the proper parts of this negotiation. It's a matter, because if we're promising, if there's a Conservative government, we're planning as a country to have a negotiation with the EU with an implementation period finishing at the end of December 2020. We can't get into this until after that, really. Not in a serious way. And then it's going to take years for that to come to fruition, because you've got the President and Congress. So this whole argument I've struggled with either as a scare story or as a promise. I think you are onto a very important area, which is, and Stephen also mentioned it, which is what is the post-Brexit economic vision?
And you touched on this in your column
Yes.
today. You were talking about how if Boris Johnson owns, say, Bassett Law Man,
Yes.
the options to him are a bit restricted in terms of where he can take our economic policy.
The entire... There is obviously a constitutional, purely abstract argument for Brexit, but there's also what I think attracted many of its leading advocates, the idea that we could have a trade and economic policy that was sharply different from what had become a social democratic norm across Europe. They have proven not capable of actually arguing for that, because it would annoy the people who were going to vote for Brexit, and then not capable of articulating it afterwards, because they still need those people in order to get a majority. By which I mean the people who advocated leave. There is a big gulf that separates the constitutional sort of national independent supporters of Brexit, who often also want bigger government, and the let's make Britain into Singapore support of Brexit. By the way, I've never been one of those people who thinks Brexit is mad, there are no arguments for it. My argument for it is I think that the very valuable advantages of Brexit are all abstract, and the very serious, important costs of Brexit are all concrete. And in the end, I personally chose the concrete over the abstract, but I have respect for people who did the opposite. But I think it's revealed by the fact that in the Conservative manifesto, it's not possible to put forward some sharp break with European policy. The only real case for having Brexit is that sharp break, and it's not possible to advocate it because you can't create a base of support for it. I don't actually want it myself particularly, but I don't. It's not there.
But that is quite a phenomenon, given the most prominent people who were advocating
Yes.
Brexit over the years, who wanted this. I mean, this is quite a sort of moment, isn't it? This is the moment that maybe the scare stories about Singapore on Thames die, or we'll see them die over the coming years. What do you think, Steve?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one I, to be honest, don't really know the answer to, because you talk to senior Conservatives, and particularly ones who are more economically liberal. If you're feeling, particularly irritating that morning, you'll kind of go, so how do you think it's going to work out with these promises? And half of them will look very glum and go, yeah, I'm really upset. Yeah, I think it's a big mistake, and we've said that the NHS is not on the table. We should be arguing for the fact, and look, companies bid to run functions for it all the time. It will still be free at the point of use, etc., etc. And they go, and it's ridiculous, we're not making the argument on agriculture. The other half will kind of look very smug and go, well, once we've got a big majority, it won't matter. Now, I'm inclined to agree with Danny. I think if you win that big majority, and it runs through people who you've promised you won't do those things, you can't do those things. But I think the idea of Singapore on Thames, what may happen to it may lose its value as an attack by the left on the right, And it will start to become a thing that part of the right goes, oh, why haven't we become Singapore-on-Thames? In the same way that after 1997, the right couldn't say that New Labour was going to transform back to old Labour, at some point in 99, 2001. But people in the Labour Party started to go, wouldn't it be wonderful to try and transform into old Labour? And of course, when they eventually left office, they did.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest complainer about welfare spending, it caused a massive row inside the Cameron government, was Ian Duncan Smith. That was the basis of one of his argument, apart from a clash of personalities, with George Osborne. And the argument was along the more liberal Remainer Conservative wanting to spend less, and Ian Duncan Smith wanting to spend more. This is the fascinating thing about the Conservative Manifesto, counterintuitively, it is not a right-wing document. Even though the purpose of leaving the European Union must, in the mind of some people, and maybe the economic imperative once you've done it,
the logic of the decision. Brussels sit there and expect us to be going in that direction.
Correct. But I think it's bilaterally very difficult. Partly also it's because at the end of a period of austerity, and we may differ on this, which I thought was mathematically, fiscally just a necessary process. But we definitely have reached the point where you do that, you run out of political consent for it, and you also reach the point where you don't need to do it in quite the same way. And at that point, it's also sensible, as well as all the other political considerations, to make sure you're spending enough money on libraries and welfare benefits and cleaning streets and potholes, right? Because you can't go on cutting those things forever. You may have to do it in order to drive the deficit down. So there's also a policy grounds for it. But the fascinating thing about it was that Brexit and the Conservative Manifesto, the idea is to get Brexit done so that you can get past it. And that is very fascinating.
It's not to create a new Jerusalem, but Correct. Just to put down the instruments of torture or take the thing off the telly.
Well, let's get Brexit off the television. That's the slogan. Very effective, by the way, a very effective campaign. And I'm not, I'm the last person to come here and say I wish the Conservative Party's manifesto was more right-wing. I'm not saying that. I'm just observing its nature.
But the forces of Brexit have meant that you have to put together a certain type of coalition to deliver it, which is diluting Brexit itself and maybe even pulling the Tories more towards the centre ground. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that we do have this slight weirdness, right? Then this is a cabinet which has more Thatcherites around it than any since 1979 and has less Thatcherism in it. Certainly than any Conservative government in that period, and potentially even arguably less than the 97 to 2010 Labour government. And the big unknown, if it works electorally at this election, can you, if you're the Conservatives, try and pivot back to having a coalition for economic liberalism by winning over Remainers who were broadly pro-austerity, pro the economic status quo, and don't like Brexit, by saying, well, look, you've lost now, so you need to come back and vote on economic lines? Or are those people lost forever? I have no idea which one it is, but it will radically change where the Conservatives end up politically if they can basically have this one use-only coalition and then go back to winning Esher and Walton, Twickenham, places which will vote for fiscal restraint, or they do have to become ironically, a more social democratic European nation state, despite the fact that, as Danny says, the whole point of Brexit for these people was to get away from the European model.
Now, a very important is there's one whacking great exception, so great that it almost obscures my point about the Conservative Party's manifesto not being generally right, and that's the nature of the Brexit itself and the idea that they'll come out of the implementation period at the end of 2020, both of which are, ideological, admittedly in the case of the Brexit promise, one that I think they should see through because of the referendum. But
the timing one, the ticking clock.
Those are quite big exceptions to that point. And the point about the key thing about it is Brexit was partly constitutional. If you or very largely constitutional. If you read Michael Gove's speeches at the beginning, Boris Johnson's articles actually, they didn't in fact make the economic Singapore upon Thames argument. They made primarily constitutional arguments, quite reasonable.
I don't think Dominic Cummings would have let them, even if they wanted to.
Well, yes, but I mean, even before they sort of joined up with him, quite reasonable points they were making about, the nature of the European court system and the European democracy and what the direction of the European Union was towards a state. Actually, now it's become sort of habitual to dismiss all these things as sort of absolutely ludicrous. How could they possibly have said those things? I think they were correct, those arguments. It's just that you have to net them off against other things, concrete costs.
Do you think you touched on there? What I thought you were about to talk about was the introduction of the deadline to
Yes.
the transition.
So yes.
Possibly one of the pledges in this election which will most haunt the next Parliament if Boris Johnson wins.
If he were to win, there'll be 2 weeks in which everyone goes, wow, and by the way, they should say that, because if he manages to get from the position that the Conservatives were in the European elections and in Parliament at that point to a majority for a fourth term, that is a very impressive political achievement, and nobody should take that away from him. But I think 2 weeks after that, people will say, my goodness, we've agreed to end the implementation period by the end of 2020, and how are we going to reach that? My view is, the biggest lesson of the Article 50 process was the clock favoured the European Union, because it weakened. The less prepared we are to leave without any trading arrangements, the easier it is for the European Union to put pressure on us to get a deal, or the less good a deal we can get. And that's exactly what happened in the withdrawal agreement, and it will happen again. So I cannot understand why we would do that. Well, I do understand the politics of it. Probably the majority is only gainable by that. The really harsh question for me, a really difficult thing, is I thought, for example, the withdrawal of the whip was appalling, right? And I think I think it's a super tragedy to end up with someone as good as David Gaunt running against the party. But I do wonder, if they win a majority, whether it won't also have proven politically necessary, if you looked at it from a distance objectively, given the coalition they're trying to assemble. Boris Johnson has been, and Dominic Cummings have been, super ruthless about uniting the Leave coalition, right? They've said nothing gets in the way of that. Being rude to our friend, driving out members of Parliament, proroguing Parliament, whatever, when people were furious. Nothing gets above signalling to the Leave coalition, we're on my side, uniting the Leave coalition to win a general election for Brexit. And if they succeed, one has to acknowledge those were all bits of it, even though I disapprove of them.
But if that final ingredient, pledging to come out of the transition by the end of 2020 and finish the negotiations by then, come what may, was the price of getting Nigel Farage to stand down in a whole load of Tory seats, was that absolutely necessary? Do you now feel, Stephen, as you look at the scale of Nigel Farage's effort and where he is in the polls and the rest of it, that actually that's a function of him standing down in half the seats, or actually it was always going to be that he wasn't a full player in this election?
I think it's a bit of both. And the reason why he stood down, I don't think actually was about any of those promises. It was about the fact that we have a Brexit deal that is a granite hard Brexit. Now, you can fairly argue about whether or not you think Boris Johnson will keep all of his promises, and maybe he will end up signing up to something significantly softer. But in terms of what is on the table, there is no intellectual political space for Nigel Farage. And so he has opted for the most graceful exit available. And I suspect that had he not done so, we'd see the same thing, because they are still declining in the polls, even in the seats where they have decided to keep standing. I just think, even though I think Danny's completely right, then their electoral projects have been about holding the Leave coalition together. I mean, it is an act of lunacy to believe that you can sign any trade agreement, particularly with a bloc that is notoriously slow at signing trade agreements, with a type of trade agreement that has never been done ever, right? There is no trade agreement in which nations have wanted to get further away from each other and to recover sovereignty. There are only trade agreements where people want to increase their trade and sacrifice their sovereignty. We're going to manage to do that within a year, or we'll crash out, I think one way or the other is going to haunt this Parliament. Either you end up crashing out, which will be more painful than people expect, or you end up signing whatever deal is on the table to avoid a crash out, which will be humiliating for the Conservative Party.
There's always a third option with Europe, isn't there, that you actually have some sort of extension, but you call it something else. Yes. I mean, there'll be some sort of
I think that's a critical thing. So there is a way through it in which you say, well, the implementation period's over, and we're now going into the implementation period, or whatever it happens to be. So I think that is possible and might be necessary, but it is an irresponsible promise. But I wouldn't say to you it was politically unnecessary. Nigel Farage they dropped in the polls because they've ceased to become a factor, that's because once they declared they weren't going to fight everywhere, they could no longer provide a prime minister or win a government, and they ceased to be the same player that they were, and you could see it happening. They lost momentum, and that was absolutely critical. And this is all, and one of the things that happens a lot of times, and particularly from people outside the Conservative coalition, is that people underestimate how significant and real are the people who support the approach that Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party and UKIP stand for. Those people are real. If you can choose to decide to ignore them and gain your votes elsewhere in the middle from the Liberals. The moment that the Conservative, that's where I preferred to get them from. But the moment the Conservative Party, the moment we had Brexit, that wasn't an option. And so to win an election, you just have to have those people. And everyone always sort of goes, oh, for example, David Cameron only had this in order to unite the Conservative Party. Well, it wasn't a few people. He did it in order to unite millions of people who had this view. And in this circumstance, these are real people too. You can't ignore them in an electoral sense. So this is, proper strategic thinking about how to gain a majority. And we shouldn't avoid seeing it just because in policy terms, I absolutely strongly think Stephen is completely correct. I think this is the moment that if they do succeed in winning an election on this basis, we will immediately find that was a promise we wish that hadn't been made, right? There you go. I certainly wish it.
Stephen, what was Labour thinking of when it sort of doubled down on the radicalism of the 2017 manifesto? What's the logic of that, and does it look like it is helping to squeeze the Remain column of the vote?
So it probably wasn't so much about logic. It was that the 2017 manifesto, which goes through Labour's arcane rules making and policy setting process, and we don't need to detain ourselves with over much here. When he was a weaker leader in 2017, so that was a manifesto designed to unify the Labour Party around something which was kind of a bit like Corbynism, whereas this time he is Labour's hegemonic leader and he can set policy pretty much as he wishes. And their analysis of what happened in 2017 was that they unified what you might think of as the small R Remain vote by talking lots about climate change, redistribution, and immigration, and kind of fairness towards people who want to come here. And so then they felt they needed to emphatically tick all three of those boxes in order to recreate what they did last time. Has it worked? I mean, it's possible, of course, the polls are completely, or actually even a little bit wrong, right? We shouldn't forget that we have a terrible electoral system that means if the Labour vote is underestimated even by 3%, then this does not work. The Conservatives win in terms of the vote, but cannot form a government. But from the polls, it looks like it hasn't worked because in 2017, they were able to move on from Brexit because they also agreed that it should happen. And the big problem, of course, is the one thing Corbyn has sacrificed in his period of dominance is he's sacrificed his preferred position, which is to be a soft Brexit party, for being a party of a second referendum. And that means that instead of being able to go, well, I and Boris Johnson both agree Brexit should happen, have you noticed your hospital's in a bit of a state? He's become the party of, look, can I please talk about your hospital while having to face continual questions about Brexit?
Were his instincts possibly right? He might be doing better, you think, if he'd stuck to his guns?
Yeah, I think then, I don't think it's Labour's only problem in this election. I think, his unpopularity is obviously a problem. I used to think that the anti-Semitism only mattered, crudely to people who were either Jewish or had Jewish friends, which in this country is not a very great number of people. But I think it has cut through in a meaningful way in this election. But really the thing which has utterly defined this election is that he was unable to hold a pro-soft Brexit position, which means there is no scrutiny of the Conservative offer on Brexit, and there is no space for Labour's offer on public services. And once you have that, the ability to turn around his negative ratings, to squeeze the Liberal Democrat vote, all of that gets taken off the table because it becomes a Brexit yes-no election.
It was very interesting to see his struggle to explain this. What he wants to say is that people who vote Leave and Remain have the same economic experience. They're just, well, we shouldn't divide them by Leave and Remain, but they are divided in that way, and therefore that position is naive. You can't be neutral about that. And it is always a problem for Labour because if you look at a sort of map of Labour votes, they had some votes down here and some votes up there with Brexit, and the Brexit in the middle they didn't know what to do about it. So it did cut right through their natural coalition. It was difficult because if you had taken that advice, you'd have lost more votes to the Liberal Democrats in cities, and possibly quite a lot more. So maybe it wouldn't have been possible to squeeze the Liberal Democrats, and then they wouldn't have got even as close as they might get. So I'm not sure, to be fair to them, I'm not sure the problem was soluble. I think the problem is that the sort of Corbynite class analysis of the sort that Andrew Murray writes about, Brexit just cuts right across that. It's not amenable to the analysis that he puts to it. The working class, to use his own phrase, are just not united on this, and so Labour's ended up in a mess because his analysis doesn't fit the facts.
I just think the crucial thing is when Labour changed its policy from being for Brexit to for a referendum, they didn't gain a single vote in the polls afterwards. And the evidence from the local by-elections and from Brecon and Radishaw is that it had not improved their position at all. The election started and then they began to improve their position as the biggest, baddest anti-conservative party. And I still think that they would have been better off. I mean, it's kind of the reverse of me saying, they shouldn't have had this promise about leaving at the end of 2020. You couldn't have unified the Labour Party around anything other than a pro-referendum position. However, once you've lost the ability to unify Labour around a soft Brexit position, which they really would have had to do in the summer of 2017 when he was very powerful, once you've lost that ability, the Lib Dem squeeze takes care of itself, bluntly, right? You do that by cutting them out of the debates, which was a masterstroke on Corbyn and Johnson's part. I think it was a lot riskier for Johnson because he needs the Lib Dems to do a bit better than they did last time. Masterstroke on Corbyn's part, that's dealt with the Lib Dem threat from that angle, but because he has an anti-Brexit policy, he hasn't dealt with his Leave voter problem, and there is no scrutiny of... We have this weird situation where the central political project of the governing party is not being scrutinised.
It's not being scrutinised at all. This is a staggering gaping hole.
Well, it's only being scrutinised at the level of should we go ahead with Brexit or not, and in that, and I've always thought that going to
we're back where we were in 2016. What is Brexit?
Going to the electorate, you got that wrong. You'll have to vote again. It isn't actually a very strong offering to lots and lots of Leave voters. I've never, personally, I voted Remain. I think leaving the European Union is a mistake. And I've endured quite a lot of sort of irritation from people I respect by refusing to support a second referendum. My feeling was we had a referendum, and I've never been able to get my head around why they didn't realise that would get a dusty answer from lots of people. And if the Conservatives were successful in uniting those people in anger, you could unusually create an electoral issue. So, that wouldn't then be the Conservatives fighting for a fourth term on their record on the NHS, which would have, they would have struggled.
Some people think the reason Labour's line on the graph in terms of its support is still climbing is because it just if you're on the Remain side of the argument, it just takes a bit longer to process all the options. There could be 5 or 6. Whereas if you're on the other side, Boris Johnson was pushing to get credibility on the Leave side, and there were only 2 options really with the Brexit party. That would suggest that actually John McDonnell was right, and they did need to move. Labour did need to move to that kind of stronger identity, and that was their only hope of getting close to winning or winning.
Well, I think that the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, right? If it turns out in 2 weeks' time that this, what seems like it might be a slight increase in the Labour vote, but might just be noise, is a genuine increase, then I think you can say that, Corbyn and I and Gloria de Piera and all of the other kind of people, on the left and centre going, no, you've just got to try and hold to a soft Brexit position, will have been completely wrong. However, if what happens, and this, to be honest, to me feels more likely, which is that there is a fairly hard ceiling on the Labour vote of 32%, and a lot of that is in places they are going to hold anyway, because they have a Brexit strategy that I think is predicated around making it easier for people in big London seats like the ones I live in to have very big majorities, and loses marginal votes in more fragile constituencies. Then of course that will have been a mistake. And we just don't know yet, because we know that some of those people voting Lib Dem are not doing so because of Brexit. They're doing so because they don't like the Labour Party in this incarnation, and they want to pull an anti-Tory lever.
And there's by the way another option, which is it wasn't a mistake. It was just that they didn't have a good solution, right? So it may just be the problem was insoluble, right? That either course they would take would be problematic, and there wasn't a good course. And that's also possible. Maybe a good course would have been steerable with somebody with a bit more flexibility and articulacy, to be honest, than Jeremy Corbyn, who actually, in some circumstances, I can find quite articulate, but in explaining his position on this has been hopeless. And to have only ended up with the position of neutrality actually during the election campaign, suggesting that they hadn't actually thought this big question through and that how terrible it would sound, when you could possibly make neutrality work, providing you really shored it up and everyone had been on board and everyone knew exactly what their role was supposed to be. But his ability to articulate it has been so poor so therefore I think that's added to the fact that there probably wasn't a good solution for Labour, to be fair to them. So I'm not sure, at the end of it, whatever, if they lose, everyone will say the solution they chose was a mistake. But it may have been that the other one would have been even worse.
Can I ask a final question? And everything was sort of slightly understated in that manifesto, and they weren't exactly trying to scare the horses. But I thought this was meant to be a change election. Now, there is the great big change that's on the front cover, Brexit, but he's kind of saying that's like the doctor tells you with the syringe. It's a small prick and you won't feel the thing. He's trying to de-risk that a bit. So is it a change election? I'm slightly confused.
I mean, he is the change, right? The Conservatives have a...
Like John Major?
Yeah, the thing that Labour politicians of a certain age will say is that in 1987 we had a brilliant defeat. Neil Kinnock, did very well, great slick videos, established his dominance within the party. We didn't change very much. In 1992, we basically went, well, let's just rerun that, but more so. The Conservatives did take their opportunity to change, and we lost. And that is one reading of the change, right? You have, who was Labour's leader in 2017? Corbyn. Who was their shadow foreign secretary? Emily Thornberry. Who was their shadow home secretary? Diane Abbott. Who was their shadow chancellor? John McDonnell. Whereas everyone in those roles on the other side has changed. And so in some ways, right, the change is simply that this guy who can say about all of the things they have done that have not worked out, all of the things they have done which haven't worked out as well as that, and all the things they've done which have been a disaster, I wasn't there, I was running London. And I think that he is the change for them.
Yes, that's probably correct. And also Brexit's a very big change, and therefore,
but not being discussed.
And therefore,
it's not being declared as that in a way. Well, it's just a thing that has to be done. That point you were making before.
Sure, but it is a big change and it's casting. What's being done cleverly is casting Parliament as the thing to be changed against. So in the sense that there is a change mood, there's a feeling that these politicians should be, how many emails does one get? But all these people should be swept away in favour of, I don't know who. That feeling is being catered to by, well, let's have Brexit. And it always has been at the level of abstraction because a lot of the good arguments for it are quite, and they are still, those doesn't mean they're not arguments, are abstract ones. But the concrete costs and the concrete organisation of the country and its international relations after Brexit, that does not being subject to much scrutiny, partly because Jeremy Corbyn is herring off after what I think we all instinctively realise is a bit of a red herring regarding Donald Trump and the NHS. And so he can't get everyone recognises his sort of clever line, but none of us are taking it seriously enough to go, well, maybe this would really happen because we mostly think it's rubbish. So it's a bit, and so therefore, if he was dealing with this implementation period thing, right? I think people would think, well, that's actually an interesting point. There's a real problem with it. What is going to happen at the end of that?
Recklessly thinking what the result might be if you had to call it now. Is John Major a clue that we might be looking at that kind of level of majority? What's your best guess now? Won't hold you to it. Nobody's listening.
Yeah, that's what I think. I mean, look, I did a lot of football prediction. You're just attaching percentages. If you say, as I do, that the central thing is that you're going to get a majority of 30 for the Tories, that does mean there's quite a long tail that means they don't get a majority, and quite a long tail that means it's a big majority. But the fundamentals don't seem to me to be there for a landslide. Then at the other end of the spectrum, I think that Jeremy Corbyn is a real drag on the approval rating, and there's real growth of incomes. So all of it leads me to think the Conservatives will win with a solid rather than a sensational majority. So yes, I'm in that John Majorist type of area, but only putting maybe 60% chance or maybe 70% chance on a Tory majority.
Stephen.
Yeah, I think that feels about right to me. I think if the election was held tomorrow, I think there would be a very comfortable Conservative win. But there's 2.5 weeks to go, and the really important thing we need to remember is the Liberal Democrats do best in elections when the result is not up for grabs. because that's when people who want to vote Liberal Democrat feel safe to do so. And if people feel safe to vote Liberal Democrat, what that does is it takes a number away from the Conservative column. That's where they're going to win seats. And I think that's probably what moves us from a situation now with a big Tory majority to one with a smaller. So I think I'd be in the same ballpark as Danny, really.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen, Danny, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.